Hypertension is a silent but deadly disease. More than 1 in 5 adults worldwide have raised blood pressure, a condition that causes around half of all deaths from stroke and heart disease. Complications from hypertension account for 9.4 million deaths worldwide every year. Hypertension Day is an annual event held on the 17th of May. The purpose is to promote public awareness of hypertension and to encourage citizens of all countries to prevent and control the silent killer. So in today's show, we focus on hypertension. And to help us understand the subject a lot better is a guest panel comprised of a specialist physician and the president of the South African Hypertension Society. You can tweet us at SABC Health Talk or simply interact with us on our Facebook page, SABC Health Talk. Sit back, relax, and learn from this exciting show ahead. I'm Dr. Solomon Daung, and this is Health Talk.
High blood pressure, medically known as hypertension, is a major risk factor for heart disease like stroke, kidney disease, and even eye diseases. When your blood pressure exceeds a certain threshold, we call it high blood pressure. Unlike many other diseases, hypertension has no symptoms, and hence it is called the silent killer.
In actual fact, high blood pressure is asymptomatic. That is why we call it a silent killer. There are other contributory factors that can make you think that it's because I'm sure my blood pressure is high. We do get some dizziness now and then. It's not actually a symptom as such. So with high blood pressure, you need to have it checked. Then we can say this is your blood pressure. According
to the World Hypertension League, 4 in 10 adults older than 25 have hypertension. The unfortunate part is around 50% of these people are unaware of their condition. Of those who are aware, half of them do not take any action to control their blood pressure, either through lifestyle modification or medication.
The only thing that I know about, I do know some of the things about hypertension, but I know that it's a sickness. That's what I know first. Secondly, I know that it can be cured, or it can be prevented. Actually, not cured, it can be prevented by the people eating healthy food and gymming, obviously. And then, even though we would be keen at solving the problem, but we'll be affecting people on the other side. Those are your doctors, your pharmacists who produce the pills and so on. But yeah, because I value men, I value a human being rather. I would say let's focus on preventing high blood and kill the business side of it, which are the pills and the doctors.
What I know about high blood, it's caused when you're overweight. A weight factor has got to do with the high blood. To maintain your high blood, you have to exercise maybe 3 times a week, and you have to control your diet. And there's a medication to maintain that your high blood is under control. And there's certain foods to eat and certain foods not to eat also.
The good news is that blood pressure is easily measurable without any discomfort. And once you know you have elevated blood pressure, you can do something to prevent and control rising blood pressure and thus avoiding potential risk.
Untreated high blood pressure can lead a lot of people into a serious problem. And we take it very mildly. The complications are like the eyes. We get things like the pupil edema of the pupil of the eye. The macula also gets affected, and at the end it's the sight.
Everyone can take steps to minimize the odds of developing high blood pressure and its adverse consequences.
I go to the gym every 3 days in a week. Then I eat good food. You must eat fruits. You must eat vegetable in order to control it the right way.
This is a deadly disease, so I decided to attend clinics, workshops bakhuluma ngayo indaba ze-high blood ne-sugar.
Right, so to learn more about what this condition, hypertension, is, we have a panel of special guests. On my extreme right is Dr. Zahira Kasimji. Dr. Kasimji is a specialist physician based at Helen Joseph Hospital. Welcome to Health Talk, Dr. Kasimji.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
All right. And next to her, closer to me, is Professor Angela Woodiwies, who is president of the Southern African Hypertension Society. And Professor Woodiwies is also based in the physiology department at Wits University. Welcome to Health Talk, Prof.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Let's start with you. What is hypertension?
Okay. Hypertension is basically raised blood pressure. In technical terms, it's a blood pressure over 140 over 90 millimeters of mercury. But more importantly, it's an increase in pressure within the blood vessels, and that is then transmitted to all the organs around the body, and so therefore damaging the heart, the brain, the kidneys, as a consequence of that elevated pressure.
Okay. Dr. Kasimji, I mean, I would imagine everybody needs some sort of pressure to drive the blood, within our arteries. So how does this concept of high blood pressure set in? When does it become abnormal?
So as Professor Woodiwies said, abnormal blood pressure is when the pressure is more than 140 over 90. So yes, you are correct. We need blood pumping to perfuse all our organs. The problem with high blood pressure is it causes damage firstly to the heart because of the increased workload, but also to the blood vessels. It damages the delicate lining of the blood vessels when this pressure is more than 140 over 90.
Okay. So I suppose it's more appropriate for me to direct this question to you. How prevalent is this problem in Southern Africa? Is it a problem?
Absolutely. You had mentioned 1 in 5 worldwide, and in South Africa it's probably even worse than that. It's an aging-related disease. So if one were to look at individuals over 60 years, it's probably 2 out of 3 individuals, which obviously is very high. It differs between urban and rural areas. In rural areas in South Africa, it's about 15%. Whereas in urban areas between 40 and 50%. So I guess you could say South Africa prevalence of hypertension in adults, in other words, over 18 years, ranges between 20 and 25%. And so that's obviously is a remarkable problem that we need to deal with.
It's interesting that you mentioned these differences between rural and urban areas, and I suppose we're going to come back to that, perhaps in the next segment when we try and understand why should that be.
Sure.
And Dr. Kasimji, I mean, you deal with these patients, I would imagine, on a daily basis. She mentioned the problem of age. So what sort of age range do you see hypertension in?
So hypertension can occur, in childhood, but that's usually secondary forms of hypertension where there's an underlying cause. Usually, patients from their late 20s upwards. The older you are, the more likely you are to have hypertension because your blood vessels stiffen, and that causes an increased pressure in the body.
Do people know about, what's the level of awareness? I mean, obviously, the primary reason why we do shows like this is to increase awareness, but what's your thoughts on the level of awareness amongst communities on hypertension?
I think there's very limited awareness. As you'd mentioned on the introduction to the show, it's a silent killer. And that's one of the biggest problems with hypertension is prior to you developing what we call target organ damage, which is damage to the kidneys, the heart, the brain, there are no signs and symptoms of hypertension. And so people are not aware that their blood pressure is elevated. And that's why during the course of May we have this wide screening program. We're trying to promote awareness and encourage all adults who haven't had their blood pressures measured over the last year to at least go and have their blood pressure checked at various places.
Dr. Sabiji, now, earlier we said, yes, again, it's a silent killer. And oftentimes you hear people talk about, I can feel when my blood pressure is high. Can we talk about typical signs and symptoms of high blood pressure, even before we start talking about complications?
The signs that people speak of are usually quite non-specific. Headaches, a bit of dizziness. Perhaps they know how their own body reacts. But unless your blood pressure is very high, you're unlikely to have many symptoms or signs, which is the problem. since that's the reason most patients don't know they have it, or that they stop taking their treatment because they feel well.
Yeah. So we can't talk about signs of high blood pressure.
We can talk about signs of very high blood pressure. So definitely, blurring of vision, severe headaches, dizziness for sure, chest pain, shortness of breath, usually associated with much more severe forms of hypertension.
Okay. But the point being that in most cases that you don't feel anything. There are no symptoms. All right. Okay, let's talk about complications. Why should we worry about high blood pressure?
Well, as we talking about complications, we have to think about the heart, we have to think about the brain, and we have to think about the kidneys. So firstly, talking about the heart, what the high blood pressure is going to do is result in what we call hypertensive heart disease, which often is associated with thickening of the wall of the heart, which makes it difficult for the heart to fill, and therefore results in what we call hypertension heart failure or hypertensive heart failure. It can also result in arrhythmias and myocardial infarctions as well.
So a whole lot of heart-related problems.
Yeah. The brain, there's certainly strokes, which is a big problem in South Africa, fifth leading cause of death, and chronic kidney disease.
Talk about chronic kidney disease. I do know that Dr. Kasemji has some special interest in kidneys. Just tell us about complications of high blood pressure in terms of kidney function.
So the two main things that can happen is chronic long-term uncontrolled hypertension can damage the vessels around your kidneys and cause kidney damage in that way. Also, if you present with severe hypertension, very, very high blood pressure, something we call malignant hypertension, that can severely narrow the blood entering your kidneys and cause kidney damage.
Yeah.
So often what we see, the first presentation of hypertension is sometimes this malignant hypertension where people present with end-stage renal failure just because they haven't known that they're hypertensive, or unfortunately if they have known but not taken their treatment.
Yeah. One thing we haven't spoken about is hypertension with other diseases. So, and the common thing here is hypertension with diabetes. Just tell us about the effect of hypertension existing with a condition like diabetes.
So it's obviously not a good thing to have both, but it's commonly seen together, as part of what we call the metabolic syndrome. So you may have diabetes, abnormal cholesterol levels, be a little bit obese, and then also have hypertension. So it's a common problem that we do see, and it has additive effects. Hypertension is definitely one of the things that worsen for instance, diabetic kidney disease. One thing that may slow down progression is actually controlling the blood pressure. So it's very important not to see it in isolation, but as you rightly said, as part of other diseases as well.
All right. Well, it's time for a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're now going to start understanding a little more about, what causes this problem of hypertension. Please stay with us.
I'm Alicia Jali, joining us live from our Johannesburg studios. A quick look now at your current news leaders. Parliament's Communications Committee has decided on 5 names to sit on the SABC's interim board. And the Constitutional Court has directed Social Development Minister Bathabile Dlamini and her department to account for their handling of the social grants contract.
And in tennis, Serena Williams has withdrawn from the BNP Paribas Open in Indian Wells and the Miami Open due to a left knee injury.
We're expecting it to move just in the towards the southern parts of the country, not so much it coming towards Southern Africa, not even touching the Mozambique channel. It's just going to move back towards the Indian Ocean.
Stay tuned to News Today, Monday to Friday from 3 to 5:30 p.m.
As one of the most unequal societies in the world, South Africa is a country of paradoxes, and this applies both to income as it does to nutrition. Today, there are 8 million obese South Africans, a form of malnutrition targeting poorer communities. Norma Africa has worked for Janet as a domestic worker for 9 years. As Norma only works for Janet twice a week and has been unable to find employment for the other days, she is left in a vulnerable position, both economically and in terms of her access to affordable and healthy foods. This is a topic that has come up in one of Janet and Norma's many conversations.
So I mentioned to her, well, just try to cut carbohydrates out of your diet. So don't eat the whites, don't eat white rice, don't eat white pasta, don't eat white bread, don't eat white pap. And she responded by saying, well, then what will I eat? And I realized that the healthy eating that I took for granted was perhaps unaffordable for her.
Despite taking Janet's concern to heart, Norma was unable to drastically change her diet in an affordable way.
When I go to the shopping, I say the healthy food, but it's too expensive to me. I only find through the vegetable can I buy it, like spinach and cabbage. But Janet told me I must buy the nuts, but it's too expensive to me because I'm working for Janet on 2 days. I think the government, if come to organize, maybe in the schools, maybe organize the people to come to teach the people, or maybe on the community to come to teach the people how to eat. I think it's better. I see my son who must go into the school to learn about it very much. Maybe then if you get someone to teach it at the school, I'm very happy of that, because most of the schools there is no teachers to teach the children at school about the healthy food.
Ponsho Sepoloane, a World Food Programme dietitian, lists an array of possible solutions to tackling nutritional inequality in South Africa.
In terms of solutions, there are several advices and solutions that Norma can consider. And I've spoken about the importance of having 5 portions of vegetables and fruits a day. But you'll say, and even Norma will ask me the question, how do I afford 5 portions of vegetables a day? It doesn't make sense, it's not feasible. So the first response is to encourage planting of those indigenous crops. Then we'll have longer term solutions. And this is not only Norma's story. So the advice is not only for Norma to take the initiative in Blackheath, but to identify several women in her context where they can do and engage in those communal vegetable gardens.
Other solutions include cutting back on salt and sugary drinks, replacing millie meal with sorghum, and using lentils and beans as alternative protein sources.
When she chooses and tries to change and start changing her lifestyle, she's actually saving on the cost that she could actually spend on visiting doctors or visiting clinics, on taxi fares, and the money that she could be using on taxi fares for her to check her blood glucose levels or to control her diabetes, she could actually use to add on her food basket.
Ponsho's takeaway message is that change needs to happen in conversation with communities in order to tackle inequality at a grassroots level.
Welcome back. Now, to learn more about, the impact that this condition has on sufferers and perhaps understand a bit more about, causes and risk factors, we still have our special guest on my extreme right, Dr. Zahira Kasimji, specialist physician based at Helen Joseph Hospital. And next to me is Professor Angela Woodiwis, president of the Southern African Hypertension Society. Now, perhaps let's start with you, Dr. Kasimji. Oftentimes when people are told that they suffer from a chronic condition, that they're going to have to be on treatment for the rest of their lives, basically. People don't take that well. What sort of impact do you see amongst your patients?
So there may initially be some denial because a chronic condition, as you say, you have to take medication. Hypertension, unfortunately, doesn't go away, and it leads to complication. So patients may be in denial initially, but I think with a bit of encouragement and seeing what the complications are, they're more likely to adhere to treatment. But we do see the impacts of patients being non-adherent, as I've mentioned previously. So they can come in, because it's silent, they don't take their treatment, and they can come in with strokes, heart failure, heart disease, kidney failure. And unfortunately, they may have been diagnosed many years earlier, but we often hear from patients, I felt well, which is why I didn't take my tablets. So the important message to the public is it is silent. It doesn't go away, and you may be feeling well, but what's happening inside your body, the damage continues.
Yeah. Prof, I mean, surely this is a problem throughout. The difficulty of accepting that, one has a chronic condition. Your perspective on that?
No, absolutely. I mean, it is a psychological thing in that people being told they've got a chronic condition, the perception is, oh, I'm unhealthy. The idea of having to take tablets every single morning or sometimes twice a day gives one the feeling there's something wrong with me, I'm not as well and as fit as I used to be. So it's a matter of trying to get across to patients how important it is to adhere to the medication and to overcome that psychological stigma that people, or perception people seem to have about taking medication being not a nice thing. I think it's far worse to have the complications of hypertension. So I think a lot of education of patients is needed and a lot of discussion with patients is needed.
All right. Let's now talk about, who's at risk of developing hypertension. If my parents have hypertension, am I going to have hypertension necessarily, Dr. Kasimzi?
If your parents have hypertension, either one of them, your risk of hypertension doubles, so yes. Other risk factors include age, because we've mentioned stiffening of your blood vessels. Race also plays an important part. So patients of black race are at higher risk for hypertension, and that's earlier onset hypertension as well as more severe hypertension.
Why is that though?
That's thought to be due to some underlying genetic factors, as well as black patients have what we call salt-sensitive hypertension. So their bodies react more in retaining salt compared to other races, and that drives up blood pressure, because once you retain salt, you retain water, and that pushes up your blood pressure. So the salt-sensitive hypertension is something that is a problem in our society.
Prof, you mentioned earlier, differences between urban and rural areas. Why is that?
Well, probably to do with lifestyle more than anything else. Obviously, the most important risk factor for hypertension is aging, which none of us can solve that problem, unfortunately. But the rural-urban issue is, in part, differences in diet. Rural communities tend to eat more healthily, fruit and vegetables, staying away from processed foods which are high in salt. And in addition, there's stresses associated with an urban lifestyle, which obviously are not there in the rural communities. And
I suppose physical activity as well, isn't it?
Very much so. I mean, the rural communities are a lot more physically active than urban communities. In urban communities where people do a lot of cycling to and from work, this is obviously internationally, in those countries the prevalence of hypertension has come down quite dramatically. So if we could get a culture of cycling, walking to work within the urban communities, that would go a long way to helping reduce the prevalence of hypertension.
Right. Dr. Kasimzi, now, just going back a little bit to the genetic story. So if I know that I am at risk of developing hypertension because, both my parents have hypertension, are there triggers? I mean, I can decide that I want to live a healthy lifestyle. I'm physically active. I look at, what I eat and so on and so forth. But are there triggers that are going to start this hypertension in me?
There could be. So lifestyle is very important. So what your diet does to your body is very important. So salt, that's really important, your salt intake. Intake of refined carbohydrates are bad. Intake of fruit and vegetables are good for preventing hypertension. Reducing your weight would be very important. Stopping smoking, reducing alcohol consumption. But I believe Professor Woody did some studies on associating genetics with other risk factors, and she mentioned that if you were obese and had some genetic predisposition, you are at much higher risk of developing hypertension. Perhaps you can expand.
Perhaps you want to expand a little on that,
Yes, I mean, there's no one magic gene for hypertension. Hypertension is what we call a polygenic trait.
Yeah.
In other words, many genes rather than monogenic, which is a single gene. So in that based on that concept, there's unfortunately no genetic screening that we can do, or there's no one gene that we can say this is going to tell you whether you're going to develop hypertension or not. So in terms of your parents, if you know that both of your parents had hypertension or had died of hypertension-related complications, the most important thing is to start screening from the age of 20 years. Measure your blood pressure at least annually, if not twice annually. Going back to the genetic story, hypertension is probably more likely a combination of what we call gene-environment interaction. So given a certain genetic makeup of a combination of various genes, plus either obesity or insulin resistance or salt sensitivity, or an unhealthy lifestyle, those two interact with each other to obviously emerge and develop hypertension.
Let's talk a little bit about salt intake. I mean, obviously there has been move to try and, reduce the amount of salt in some of the commercially available foodstuffs like bread and so on. So, and you mentioned earlier the issue around perhaps, African people having a propensity to retain salt. So how important is salt intake in the development of hypertension?
There's a clear causal relationship with having high intake of salt and developing hypertension. So the WHO recommends that we take in about 5 grams a day, which is about a teaspoon. But South Africans and probably internationally, we take in far higher values than that.
Yeah.
And as you said, it's found in the foods that we commonly eat: bread, margarines, stock cubes, soups, hidden places for salt. It's not necessarily the salt that we're adding to our food. And when studies have shown that by decreasing your salt intake, your blood pressure definitely does decrease.
All right. Very interesting. Well, we're going to be spending a bit more time just on that, because I think the important part of this show is to say, how can you prevent or perhaps even delay development of hypertension? But that after the break. So now, time for a quick break. After the break, we talk prevention. Please stay with us.
Have we taken enough responsibility for our responsibilities with regards to freedom?
Largely the moment of 1994, that moment of absolute magic. Firstly, the voting, and of course when we watched Nelson Mandela take that oath of office, was a moment that we thought, well, we've now reached freedom. This is it. This is all that it can be.
Off with the big story of the day, where Eugenie Bouchard beat Maria Sharapova for the first time. Bouchard upped the ante and closed off the 3-hour epic grudge match with a rousing performance to win the most highly anticipated match so far in this year's clay season. Final score 7-5, 2-6, 6-4. Title chasers Cape Town City FC travel to Pretoria, intent on grabbing 3 points from a resurgent SuperSport United.
Get all the dominating stories locally and globally on Newsroom every Monday to Friday from 9 a.m.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us. We're discussing hypertension, and we're now going to be talking about prevention with my two special guests, Dr. Zahira Kasimji, who's a specialist physician based at Helen Joseph Hospital, and Professor Angela Woodiwies, president of the Southern African Hypertension Society, based at Wits University. Okay, let's start perhaps the most important part of the show. Okay, how do we prevent, or how do we... Perhaps we should start by talking about screening. Earlier on we said, look, you know, this is a silent killer. You're not going to have typical symptoms. Screening. What's your advice? Let me start with you, Prof. What's your advice in terms of screening? Who should screen? How often? When?
Screening is very, very important. Any adult over the age of 35 should have their blood pressure checked annually. Importantly, if you've, as I've mentioned earlier, if you've got a family history of hypertension, in other words, one of your family members has passed away from a stroke, myocardial infarction, chronic kidney disease, then certainly from the age of 20, annual blood pressure screening. As it's May Measurement Month, there are screening facilities around South Africa at the moment, various retail pharmacies, various programs involved in health management, and it's a month that we advise everybody to go and screen their blood pressure and check for hypertension.
All right. Earlier you mentioned, when we spoke about prevalence, that we are beginning to see childhood hypertension. So in terms of children, I mean, is it advisable, or is it even practical, you know, for screening there, or who should be screening in younger ones?
I suppose if there's a family history of hypertension, also if there's childhood obesity or any underlying secondary cause of hypertension, like a hormonal disorder or endocrine disorder, we should screen for hypertension. Okay. Generally, one can start even earlier. So you can suggest that adults, even after the age of 18, at least everyone should check their blood pressure at least once. If it is normal, you can probably check it again in 2 to 3 years. But if it's in this pre-hypertension range, so that's somewhere between normal and hypertension, so that's somewhere between 120 to 139, the top value, the systolic value. Okay, I
think let's stay there a little bit, because we often say to people, know your numbers. And people, you'll often hear saying, I was told my blood pressure was high, it was 200. So just explain that concept once again. When you talk blood pressure, how many numbers are you looking at? Okay, so what is this so-called systolic, diastolic?
So it's two numbers, for instance, 120/80. The top number is called the systolic number, and it's when the heart contracts and pushes blood out into the blood vessels and to the organs. Okay. And the bottom number is the diastolic number, when the heart relaxes and fills blood.
Okay, so we're saying to people they must know both numbers.
Yes.
The top number and the bottom number. And we're saying they should get worried if the numbers exceed what?
So 120/80 is said to be a normal blood pressure, or anything below that. 140/90 is hypertensive. But somewhere in between there, people shouldn't be complacent. If your blood pressure is in between those two figures, you should aggressively change your lifestyle to prevent the development of hypertension. Even if you're not hypertensive, so even if your blood pressure is not 140/90, but it's say 135/85, you are still at higher cardiovascular risk than someone whose blood pressure is 120/80. Okay. So it's important not to ignore it and say, oh, I don't have hypertension, but to do everything you can to lower that blood pressure.
Okay. Prof, we're not going to get too technical about, you know, how to measure the blood pressure and so on, but we're essentially saying the public out there, you don't have to necessarily go and visit a specialist to get your blood pressure measured. You can go anywhere, and any of these devices, you're saying basically are accurate.
Not necessarily, although I'm saying it's very important to go to any screening facility to have your blood pressure measured. It is very important that it's measured accurately, and that is indeed a big problem within South Africa. If you have your blood pressure measured manually by auscultation, that's with the stethoscope and the bone manometer, that's generally, regardless of who it's done by, whether it be a physician, a sister, a pharmacist, is generally not done according to guidelines and therefore not particularly accurate. So in that context, it's far better to have your blood pressure measured by an automated machine. That having been said, there's a whole list of accredited devices, and there's also a list of non-accredited devices. And
but I guess for the public out there,
public
it's going
out
to be
there,
difficult to know which is accredited.
The public out there won't know, unfortunately. There are moves afoot to try and encourage all facilities to have accredited devices. However, regardless, one should have one's blood pressure measured because the level of accuracy is reasonable, and that it will certainly pick up whether your blood pressure is dangerously high or not. Okay. We talk about this threshold value of 140/90, but essentially it's a continuum. I mean, there's no magic number. If you're 139, you're fine. You're 140, you're not fine. It is a continuum. And as we were just saying, you know, any elevation in your blood pressure, even if it's 135/85, is a problem.
Okay.
So
if I'm Joe Soap or Joe Mazibugo, I go to a pharmacy, I get told my blood pressure is high. Should I then say, oh my goodness, I now have hypertension based on that one reading, or what should I do?
So no, the guidelines are quite clear. You need to have demonstrated a high blood pressure on several occasions.
Right.
And it's also important how the blood pressure was done and when it was done. You need to be seated, rested, not have exercised, not have taken caffeine, and it needs to be demonstrated that it's repeatedly abnormal. So at least say 3 measurements over a few weeks.
Yeah. Okay, let's start talking about then, the prevention. I mean, clearly, there's not much you can do about, who your parents are. You don't have a choice there. But what are the common things that people can do to try and delay development of hypertension, other than obviously the screening that we've just spoken about? Prof?
Yeah. Certainly leading a healthy lifestyle. We've spoken about diet, obviously fruit and vegetables, decreasing fatty foods, avoiding processed foods which are high in salt, bread, cheese, also very high in salt. Certainly adding no salt to your food on the table, not cooking with salt. Exercise, obviously very important, and for that people shouldn't be daunted. We're not saying go and cycle the Argos or run the Comrades Marathon. Just walking 30 minutes every day, brisk walking, more than adequate. Certainly no smoking, and cutting down on refined sugars. Those are most important.
Do you wanna add to that? But perhaps a related one could be, someone was told that he or she has borderline, let's just call it borderline hypertension, and is advised to change lifestyle and starts a physical activity program and checks blood pressure, and blood pressure is fine. What should that person do, especially somebody at risk? Should that person say, oh, I'm fine now, I'll never have hypertension? What would your advice be for someone like that?
Well, obviously to continue their lifestyle modification, but it really does depend on the value of their blood pressure and if they have any underlying diseases. So there's certain compelling indications where doctors will start a tablet for blood pressure without waiting for lifestyle modification. And those are things like if you're diabetic, if you have many other risk factors, like you have heart disease, if you're very obese, if you have a strong family history of heart disease, if you already show what we call target organ damage. So we can check this target organ damage by looking into your eyes and seeing if hypertension has affected your eyes, or doing a urine test to check if there's protein in your urine, or if you have any complications of hypertension already, then we are more inclined to start treatment. But if you don't have any of those things, I'd say lifestyle modification and regular checkups.
So there's nothing like, if you're advised by a doctor to start treatment for hypertension, you say, no, let's wait a bit, and I'll go and change my lifestyle first. If you've been advised that you're at a point where you need to now start being on treatment, you can't postpone that.
So if you have no underlying problems like the ones that I've mentioned, and your blood pressure is say 140/90 repeatedly, and you've tried 3 to 6 months of lifestyle modification and your blood pressure is still high, then yes, you probably should start a tablet for antihypertension.
All right. Okay, very interesting. All right, time for another quick break. After the break, we'll now talk treatment. Please stay with us.
the Pan-African Parliament as a legislative body could go a long way in continuing to promote women's rights in all African member states.
Moon will be elected president. A decisive win by him will provide much needed stability in South Korea.
The Deputy President and the SADC Oversight Committee have been mandated to convene a multi-stakeholder national dialogue before elections.
5 teams are trapped in the relegation mud. These include Bloemfontein Celtic, 12th on the log, followed by Chipa United, Free State Stars and Baroka, who are second from the bottom, as well as Highlands Park, who have won only 4 matches.
We're on point with breaking stories, detailed economy and sport. Tune into Midday Report every Monday to Friday from 12 p.m.
Welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us. Our topic today is hypertension, and now we're talking treatment of hypertension with our 2 special guests, Dr. Zahira Kasimji, specialist physician based at Helen Joseph Hospital, and Professor Angela Woodiwies, president of the Southern African Hypertension Society. Let's start with you, Dr. Kasimji. Treatment for hypertension. There's all sorts of tablets out there. And we don't have to obviously go through, all the different names and that sort of. But what methods of treatment are available for hypertension?
Okay, so apart from the lifestyle modification that we've spoken about, I mean, salt and weight, etc., there are specific antihypertensive treatments, and our South African guidelines are quite clear about which drugs to start for which patients, depending on what underlying conditions that you have. So the usual type of drugs we'd start is something like a calcium channel blocker, an ACE inhibitor, a diuretic, which is a water tablet. We choose from one of those drugs depending on your underlying conditions.
And oftentimes, what determines the number of tablets that people take? So
if you come in with extremely high blood pressure, often we start more than 1 tablet. If your blood pressure is usually like under 160/100, we usually will try 1 tablet, follow you up and see if you're responding to that. But what really also helps is not just saying, okay, now I'm on blood pressure tablets, I don't have to do the rest. So reducing your salt intake while you are on blood pressure tablets is very important. That helps the medication work better. Losing weight helps the medication work better. So it's all additive.
All right. I guess that's the important, aspect, educating people that are on, treatment for hypertension. Yeah?
Absolutely. As we discussed earlier, the problem with hypertension is there are no signs or symptoms. So often if you're feeling well, you'll say, well, why do I need to take my tablets? Or you may well forget to take your tablets. So the biggest problem with hypertension is the lack of adherence to medication. And so there are various hints and tips, I guess. Family members can help remind patients to take their tablets. One can get into habits, take your tablets every morning with your cup of coffee or your cup of tea, so it's something you won't forget your coffee in the morning, so hopefully you won't forget your tablets too.
We're going to come back to, because I'd like us to focus a little more on that, because I think that's the biggest problem. People stopping treatment for various reasons. Maybe let's just talk about that. Why do people stop and start treatment, and why do you think we have this problem of non-adherence to treatment?
Sure. So One of the main problems, we've discussed this already, is that it's silent. You feel well, so you feel, I'm okay. I don't need to take treatment.
Right.
The second problem is side effects. So all medications can have side effects, but it's important for our public to know that if you are experiencing side effects, come in and tell your health practitioner. There are many other drugs that we can change you to. You don't necessarily have to persist with the tablet that's causing problems. For instance, one of the common tablets we give causes a cough, and many patients may stop the treatment because of the cough, but there are alternatives.
Right.
And the other thing is pill burden. You know, we're giving patients lots of different tablets to take every day, which is, it's tiring for them to do.
Especially if they have other conditions as well, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Now, so here's this person that says, I've started treatment on this type of medication and starts a physical activity program that, you know, has not been there before. What's your advice in that situation?
So that's recommended.
Yeah.
The blood pressure may even decrease as a
Right.
result of being more physically active.
Right.
During the exercise period, it's normal for blood pressure to go up while you are exercising, but the long-term effects is that it will reduce your blood pressure over time.
Okay.
And then, you know...
So that what you're saying is it may actually be positive in that it may reduce
Absolutely.
either the dosage or the amount of tablets that are necessary
Absolutely.
to control
And
it.
if you're feeling, so if you've started now lifestyle modification and now you're feeling a bit dizzy every time you take your blood pressure or unwell, perhaps your blood pressure is too low, and your doctor can reduce your medication.
Okay. So, cost of, you know, medication. You hear sometimes, you know, there's talk of more expensive medication and less expensive medication, generic substitutions, and so on. Let's talk a little bit about that, because oftentimes you get patients or members of the public being changed from one treatment to what's called a generic substitution, which is exactly the same formulation as the other. But then some people have problems with that, to say no. But this drug is not going to work as well as the other one. Your comment on that?
In general, the generics work just as well as the non-generics. Hypertension medication, the most commonly used form of hypertension medication are thiazide-like diuretics, and they are relatively inexpensive, and most patients who have only mild hypertension can be treated with just one agent, which would be a thiazide-like diuretic. Once you start having to take 2 tablets, there are a number of ACE inhibitors, which are relatively inexpensive as well, and calcium channel blockers. So unlike other diseases, it's not an extremely expensive disease to treat.
Right. So is there any such thing as there are a class of drugs or some drugs that don't work well?
Certain drugs work better for certain populations.
Right.
That can also be race-based. So certain drugs may work better for different race groups, and doctors are aware of that and tailor the medication towards that. Also, if you have, say, kidney disease or diabetes, we're more likely to start a specific tablet. It's trial and error, so some work for some don't work for others. We often add medication if it's not working, and there are a lot of different medications available. So.
Okay. And there's all sorts of different combinations, so
Absolutely.
it's a matter of being patient with your treating doctor and try and follow instructions.
Yes.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about, you know, other forms of supporting treatment. Oftentimes you hear people talk about herbal medications and so on that, you know, help reduce or support treatment of high blood pressure. Your comment on that? And I'll ask both of you to comment.
That may all be well and good. The problem with herbal medication, it's not regulated. It doesn't have to go through strict testing, you know, FDA approval, etc. So anyone can come out with a tablet and say it lowers your blood pressure, which may be true, but it may have a myriad of side effects that we are not aware of. So I would be cautious about just taking anything over the counter. Perhaps bring it to your healthcare practitioner and discuss it. Chances are they're not going to even know what's inside it. So.
It may not only be herbal medicines, but also homeopathic medications. So your comment on that?
No, absolutely. I'd like to confirm. I mean, none of the herbal or homeopathic medications have been through the rigorous scientific process. So there are no proven beneficial effects currently with respect to herbal or medication that we're aware of.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Zahira Kasimji, Specialist Physician, Helen Joseph Hospital, Prof. Angela Woodiwis, President, Southern African Hypertension Society. Thank you so much for your time. It's been such an insightful discussion, and I hope people out there got the message that essentially, you know, you need to be screening, you need to know your numbers. If you haven't been to check your blood pressure, you don't know what your blood pressure is like, please, you're advised to go and check. And if you are advised to be on medication for high blood pressure, please try and follow those instructions. Yes. Well, it's on that note that, unfortunately, we end our show today. That's all we had for you today. Join us again on SABC, same time, same place. And a reminder to please share your comments with us via our Facebook page, SABC Health Talk. And yes, follow us on Twitter at SABC Health Talk. Now look out for the new schedule of repeat shows to be announced soon. I'm Dr. Salomon Down. Thank you so much for watching, and please do take care.